Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in AP English, and we turn now to lecture number 2 in our World of Ideas lectures, Intro to Part 1, Government. Now our assumptions here right away are that you have already watched our lecture number 1. That's really important. Go back and study that at learnstrong.net in the AP folder, the World of Ideas folder, if you haven't, so that way you have a sense of kind of the ground we've already covered. Also, just to remind, we're always wanting to remind ourselves of the learning theory that will always stand behind our work in 303, that desire to connect new information to old information in meaningful ways, as well as our 3 levels of reading. Level 1, summary, we're going to practice that one here. Level 2A, talking about themes and messages, as well as our big 5, and then at 2B, this focus on rhetoric. And then at level 3, how can I relate this information to other things I already know at 3A, other texts, and then finally at 3B, to self. Now, while we won't do a whole lot of that in this introductory lecture, because all we're doing is setting up our study, still nonetheless, I think it's important that we have that at least stated. Now, we've got 5 readings in this part 1, labeled government. We're going to have Lao Tzu's From the Tao Te Ching, we're going to have Machiavelli's A Cutting from the Prince, we're going to have Rousseau's Origin of Civil Society, we're going to have Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, and finally Hannah Arendt's Ideology and Terror as the last of the essays in this selection. Now, I mentioned in our earlier introductory lecture that Mortimer Adler stands in large measure behind so much of what we do in 303, and his ideas collected in forms of essays in the Syntopicon of the Great Book series. Just to give you a simple example of this, in Syntopicon Volume 1, pages 637 to 664 is totally given, an essay with referencing, totally given to the study of the topic of government. This is how he begins in Adler-like prose. The usual connotation of government is political. The word is often used interchangeably with state, but there is government in a university, in an economic corporation, in a church, in any organization of men associated for a common purpose. The theologian speaks of the divine government of the universe, and the moralist speaks of reason as the ruling power in the soul which governs the appetites or reasons. In all these contexts, the notion of government involves the fundamental relations of ruling and being ruled, of command and obedience. Though the character of these relationships varies somewhat with the terms related, there's enough common meaning throughout to permit a general consideration of the nature of government. But that is not the way in which government is discussed in the great books. For the most part, government is considered in one or another of its special settings, as it functions in the family or the state, in the soul of the university. The common thread of meaning is noted only indirectly by the way in which comparisons are made or analogies are drawn between the various modes of government. Well, I share this with you because obviously as young students, I think it makes sense for you to pay attention to the ways others have used this term. For example, you have the advantage, so use it, of having right in front of you the technology that allows you quickly to do some search of the word government. And what is it that people out there will say about this notion of government? Study the word itself and where it comes from. Let's turn to the introductory set of comments. And again, all of these parts will have a little essay that we'll introduce. I'm going to go ahead and read this with you now to model what I want you to do for all the rest of them. Notice how I'll read, I'll pause, I'll ask questions. I'll begin to get a sense of what it is that I'm going to look at. So in other words, I'm not going to just jump and start reading my Lao Tzu. No. I want to have some sense of why, for example, Lao Tzu would end up in a section that's headed government, for example. Let's read. I'm on page 12 of your volume. At the core of any idea of government is the belief that individuals need an organized allocation of authority to protect their well-being. There's an interesting starting definition, all right? However, throughout history, the form of that allocation of authority has undergone profound shifts, and each successive type of government has inspired debates and defenses. The first civilizations in Mesopotamia and Egypt, 4000 to 3000 BCE, were theocracies ruled by a high priest. Gradually, these political systems evolved into monarchies, in which a king whose role was separate from that of the religious leaders held power. Now I'll just pause for a moment. If I'm taking notes, I'm right about here going to begin to have a dialogue with the writer and say, wait a minute, you've defined government, just briefly, and now you're giving me kind of a historical understanding of how we've thought about this notion of government over the years. So I'm going to go into my notes at level 1, and I'm just going to simply summarize this movement from epoch to epoch. Notice, this is a chronological understanding of the idea of government. Very similar, of course, to the chronology lectures that we've given, the timeline lectures that we've given. You can go back to Learn Strong and take a look at those. To continue now. During the 6th century, the Greek city-state Athens developed the first democratic system wherein male citizens, but not women or slaves, could elect a body of leaders. As these forms of government developed, so too did the concept of government as the center of law and administration. We want to write down those two words, law and administration. Obviously, it's going to play into this notion of government. However, governments and ideals of governments, actual or ideal, we think of our comments regarding Plato's Republic as an ideal state, have not followed a straight path. History has witnessed constant oscillations between various forms and functions of government, from tyrannies to republics. In turn, these governments and their relation to the individual citizen have been the focus of many great thinkers. Now, of course, we're assuming a whole lot in this first paragraph. That tension, as we've sometimes talked about it, between the individual versus the group. Is it my life and I can do whatever I want? Well, certainly, if you're going to argue any kind of notion of personal freedom, that's important. But we've also said in 303 that the only way you got here was two people hooked up and exchanged fluids, and at least to this point anyway, that's the only way anybody gets here. So to that degree, in some fundamental way, it's never been your life, it's always been our life, as we've often said in 303. There is obviously tension between these two things, and when we study our John Stuart Mills on liberty, we're going back to that same notion. Here, notice, we're playing the same game. Now to get, notice, this first introductory paragraph, again, I'm walking you guys through it this first time, because I want you to give this kind of close reading to each one of these part introductions. Notice now he's ready to turn to the actual selections from the reading itself, from the textbook. In this section, the readers represented have concentrated on both the role and form of government. Lao Tzu reflects on the ruler who would, by careful management, maintain a happy citizenry. So there you go. I mean, in one line, he's already kind of given you the heart of what you'll find in your study of Lao Tzu. Machiavelli places the survival of the prince first above all other considerations of government, and unlike Lao Tzu, ignores the concerns and rights of the individual. Notice already we have contrastive kinds of understandings, and it's not going to shock you that there will be one of the suggested essays for writing that would from your reading that would be specific to comparing and contrasting Lao Tzu and Machiavelli's views of politics and government. Notice it begins though with our introductory reading. For Machiavelli, power is the issue, and maintaining it is the sign of good government. We're back to the Thrasymachon argument of Republic 1, obviously. Go back and take a look at our lectures on learnstrong.net over that. Rousseau's emphasis, now the third writer, Rousseau's emphasis on the social contract focuses on the theory that citizens voluntarily submit to governance in the hopes of gaining greater personal freedom. By the way, you would want to see that term, social contract, and recognize it as an important two words of this paragraph. And recognize that when we're talking social contract, we're talking some notion by Rousseau that will be significant. So already, notice, we're being set up for it. Rousseau explores this idea in clear original terms. Third paragraph. While governing well concerns most of these thinkers, the forms of governments concern others. Thomas Jefferson struggled with the monarchical form of government, as did Rousseau before him, and envisioned a republic that would serve the people. By the way, it's a very, very subtle thing that just got said, but notice, he makes the argument that a lot of Jefferson's ideas about government are derived from the French, especially Rousseau. Kings were a threatened species in the 18th century Europe, and with Jefferson's age, they became extinct in the United States. Hannah Arendt, who will be our last of the five, was convinced that the totalitarian governments of the 20th century were the product of new ideologies formed from misunderstanding Darwinian theories and misapplying Marxian concepts of class struggle. Wow, now that's an important line. Notice some other names getting thrown in that obviously we're going to have to run down. Now, we're going to go through, notice your paragraph break. Now we're going to go through just briefly some ideas of each of the writers in a little bit more detail. Starting your notes here, I hope you guys are listening to what I'm saying. Starting your notes here will help you when you get to these readers, because to these writers and to their readings, because already you've been set up to it. Let me give an example. Here we are now in the next paragraph. Lao Tzu, whose writings provide the basis for Taoism. By the way, we pronounce the T as a D in Chinese. One of the three major Chinese religions, was interested primarily in political systems. His work, the Tao Te Ching, has been translated loosely as the way of power. One thing that becomes clear from reading his work, especially the selections presented here, is his concern for the well-being of the people in any government. He does not recommend specific forms of government, monarchic, representative, democratic, or advocate election versus the hereditary transfer of power, but he does make it clear that the success of the existing forms of government in his era monarchy depends on good relations between the leader and the people. He refers to the chief of state as master or sage, implying that one obligation of the governor is to be wise. One expression of that wisdom is the willingness to permit things to take their natural course. Lao Tzu's insistence on inactivity in government is complex. What in Taoism we call wu wei. We'll have more to say about it. It does not imply sloth, to be lazy. It implies instead the ability to participate in the natural order of events and to resist the impulse to do things that do not need to be done. In other words, he condemns useless busyness. His view is that the less the master needs to do, or perhaps the less government needs to intervene, the happier the people will be. When we meet Thoreau's Civil Disobedience later in this volume, we'll hear something quite similar, and we'll begin to see the connectivity of ideas. All right, so that paragraph is ended. Now, if you're doing your annotative work with me right now, then pause for a moment and write down 3 things from that paragraph about Lao Tzu that will be the most significant that you want to hold on to and to remember as you get ready to actually do the reading of Lao Tzu here in a bit. Next paragraph, we'll treat Machiavelli. Niccolo Machiavelli was a pragmatic man of the Renaissance in Italy. As a result, as a theoretician, as a member of the political court, he understood government from the inside and carefully examined its philosophy. Because his writings stress the importance of gaining and holding power at any cost, Machiavelli's name has become synonymous with political cunning. Go back to our comments in Republic 1, Plato's Republic 1, where we talked about the Thrasymachon argument. Machiavelli is the Thrasymachon argument on steroids, or what we might call strategic violence, both physical as well as linguistic, intellectual, propagandic violence. However, notice, this is what is assumed about Machiavelli. However, a careful reading of his work, as a reflection of the instability of his time, shows that his advice to wield power ruthlessly derived largely from his fear that a weak prince would lose his city-state of Florence to France or to other powerful plundering nation. His commitment to a powerful prince is based on his view that in the long run, strength will guarantee the peace and happiness of the citizen for whom independence is otherwise irrelevant. Therefore, Machiavelli generally ignores questions concerning the comforts and the rights of the individual. The famous line, "He who builds on the people builds on mud." We'll get to that conversation. Now, pause, jot down 3 things from that paragraph that was said about Machiavelli that you want to make a note of to set you up to your actual reading study of Machiavelli's Prince here in bed. To continue. In contrast, Jean-Jacques Rousseau is continually concerned with the basic questions of personal freedom and liberty. A fundamental question in the origin of civil society is that the individual's agreement with the state is designed to increase the individual's freedoms and not diminish them. Rousseau says this, while at the same time admitting the individual forfeits certain rights to the body politic in order to guarantee overall freedom. We heard something of this, obviously, in our study of Hobbes and Leviathan. We'll play a similar game here. Moreover, Rousseau describes civil society as a body politic that expects its rulers, including the monarch, to behave in a way designated to benefit the people. Such a view in late 18th century France was revolutionary. The ruling class at that time treated the people with great contempt, and the monarch rarely thought of the well-being of the common people. Notice again, in this paragraph, just like in the Machiavelli paragraph, just like in the Lao Tzu paragraph, we have references to the historical context when these writers will be doing their writing, okay? So it's significant. We're always paying attention to circumstances, historically speaking. Rousseau's, just to continue and finish now, Rousseau's advocacy of a republican form of government in which the monarch served the people was a radical view at the time and would find its ultimate expression decades later in the French Revolution. Wow. So, and obviously our study of Charles Dickens' Tale of Two Cities comes immediately to mind. Pause for a moment, write down 3 things here that you want to learn from this paragraph about Rousseau. Now, if this intro does anything, and I hope it does a number of things for us, but if it does anything, one of the things it does is it sets us up. It gives us some reason to be interested in the text that will be coming. Where, for example, we'll say, well, I think I'm really interested to read what Rousseau has to say. I mean, one guy's essay could generate a revolution. Well, look who the next paragraph's about, and we'll not be too shocked. Thomas Jefferson's views were also radical, you think? Armed with the philosophy of Rousseau and others, John Locke will come to mind. His Declaration of Independence advocates the eradication of the monarch entirely. Not everyone in the colonies agreed with this view, which is hypercritical to why that pronoun we is used. Remember that notion about the antecedent to the pronoun, who is the we that Jefferson is speaking of. Indeed, his political opponents, such as Alexander Hamilton, Aaron Burr, were far from certain such a view was correct. In fact, some efforts were made to install George Washington as king. Obviously, he refused. We know that story. In the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson reflects Rousseau's philosophy by emphasizing the right of the individual to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and the obligation of government to to serve the people by protecting those rights. Well, pause for a moment, jot down 3 things that you want to already be reminded of or informed of, right? Because in your junior year, I know that you studied the Declaration of Independence with me very, very closely. We can go back to learnstrong.net in the junior folder to find that lecture if you want to review it. But we're going to pick it up again, we'll come back to it. That's what makes great works of literature, because we come back to them over and over again. The last paragraph, to now comment on our last writer. The issues of freedom, justice, and individual rights were all virtually irrelevant in the totalitarian regimes that served as the focus for Hannah Arendt's work. Arendt argued that the fascist states, especially Nazi Germany and the communist states, especially the Soviet Union, represented a novel form of government, one in which individual rights were sacrificed for the good of the state. In her work, The Origins of Totalitarianism, Arendt argues that the power of totalitarian states rises from the extreme distortion of logical premises coupled with the use of terror to enforce the ideology. The result is a form of government that eclipses the tyrannical extremes Rousseau and Jefferson sought to eradicate and exceeds even Machiavelli's imaginings of absolute power. Okay, pause, jot down 3 things. If that little paragraph doesn't interest you in the great Hannah Arendt, I don't know what would. Brilliantly stated, succinctly stated, Arendt will resurrect questions which have to be taken seriously in the 21st century. No question about it at all. The rise of totalitarianism in the world from the 20th century on, Arendt's going to have a whole lot to say about that as well. Well, there it is. Let's turn now to our study of Lao Tzu and begin to take good notes. Again, the hope is read on your own, annotate on your own, and then come to my comments as a way to help enhance your study. I look forward to this study. Come back for lecture number 3 and Lao Tzu.